Why do you say that, Father? You aren't afraid, are you?
No, but I respect some of the superstitions of others. Often they are founded in fact.
Broadcasting live from our Sanctum Sanctorum in Venice, California. This is the Sixth Sense Society. I'm your host, Krista, here with our producer, Michael, and today we welcome back to the show Reverend Jim McGrath. He is the associate pastor at Gateway Christian Church and is also a screenwriter and playwright. He's been on the show before, and we always enjoy our conversations. And today he's going to be talking about King Solomon. But before we get started, Michael has a few announcements.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our show, and we're really glad to have you guys. Got all kinds of great stuff coming up. Next week, of course, is our beginning of the month with Krista Spell It Out, and she's going to talk about something fascinating that she will decide. So it's kind of our little free-for-all. And then we've got some really great guests and stuff coming up in June. So we're still in the planning stage and getting it all firmed up, but we'll have that in the next couple of days. Get all the information on our website, sixthsensesociety.com, SIXTH, all spelled out. And while you're there, if you can afford to, buy us a coffee on Ko-Fi. It really helps. But one of the most important things, click like and subscribe and tell your friends about us and help us grow our audience, because that's really the biggest thing with us. And we just love entertaining you guys. So I'm not going to take up too much time because there's just so much to cover with King Solomon. It's just one of those fascinating characters for me. And I'm really glad we have Jim here to cover it, because he couldn't ask for a better person. So with that, I'm going to kick it back to you guys. So take it away, Jim and Krista.
Great. Thank you, Michael, and welcome.
Oh, thanks. It's really great to be here. It's been a while.
Yeah, it has. Though you've been on the show, I've looked at, I think you've been on more than anybody else.
No.
Yeah.
Really?
This is your 13th show. But we had you on in 2018. You're one of the few people on that we started like in November, and there was only like a few guests, and you were one of our first guests.
Wow,
then.
what an honor.
So
that's great.
That's how much we like you.
Oh, I love it. I love the show. I love you.
So, and so we decided to do this topic because we thought it'd be interesting to really look at the biblical King Solomon and see if there's any clues as to why he might be such a lightning rod of interest for the occult world. Though, I mean, the biblical Solomon is interesting as for himself. You know, he's a figure that most people know, even if they don't go to church, and famous for certain stories. So let's get started on looking at King Solomon.
Well, one of the things about King Solomon is that he is a world cultural figure. I mean, he shows up in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and there you've got, three of the big religions. He's, I think, to get at the heart of King Solomon, you have to go to the most, what's the most famous King Solomon story?
The one about the baby.
The baby. The two mothers, one baby. They bring their issue to King Solomon. He says, cut the baby in half. And one of the mothers says, oh, let her have him. I just want to see the baby live. And so King Solomon decides, because she says that she's the real mother, that she's the one who cares about the baby. And even if, it doesn't say this, but I would add, even if she's not the biological mother, she's the one that should raise the child because she cares. And the point of the story goes to intention. Which of these women had the correct intention rather than any kind of biological proof? And so if you then turn to the story of Solomon when he first becomes king, and he has in a dream a conversation with God, it's the same basic thing as that story. But I want to go back a little bit. When King David was dying, one of his, he had a number of sons, and one of them just proclaimed himself king, and it was working all the politics, and King David was very ill. And Solomon's mother, Bathsheba, and the prophet Nathan go to David and implore him to make Solomon king right away, and they do. Solomon is 12 years old, and at that point, David gives Solomon a charge that he walk in the ways of God and that he respect the law of Moses. And it's those exact words that are said by father to son in a bar mitzvah ceremony today. It's that same charge.
Wow.
12 years old is when a kid gets his bar mitzvah, and I think that's because of Solomon. So start right there. That's a big influence. That's something that's still done today. So Solomon at age 15, he offers up a sacrifice to God, and in a dream God comes to him. And this is from 1 Kings, and I got to be straight what the sources are here, because there's many different sources to the story. But God says, I will give you one wish. And Solomon wishes for a heart that hears. I want you to give me a heart that hears. And what he meant by that is, I'm a kid, and I want to be a good king, a king that's good for the people. And how, in the words of 1 Kings, how do you judge another man? How do you do it? And so he basically asks for not just wisdom. Usually it's described as wisdom, but it's more heart awareness that he asks for. And just as Solomon does in that story about the two mothers, God says, because that's what you wished for, rather than money, women, fame, power, you wished for a heart that would make you a good king. I'm going to give you all that other stuff too. He says, I'm going to give you wisdom. I'm going to give you the heart that can judge others. But I'm also going to give you great wealth and great power and great fame. You'll be the greatest king who ever lived.
Now, I was just thinking when you said that about judging others, how long were kings in that role, where that people would come in with their problems and the king would decide? Because that didn't seem to be forever.
Well, if you go back to in biblical Jewish history, to the time of judges, the judges, they were not people that sat in a courtroom. They were people that went out and led men in battle. And they were in charge of everything. They were seen, because they were successful in battle, they were seen as being people of great wisdom who had God's favor. And so it was to the judges that you would go. And the judges kind of morphed into kings. So I think that's something that certainly is there in the history of the Jewish tradition, that the king would be the one that you would go to. The thing about Solomon that I think is unique of all the figures, the great figures of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, is before him, you establish greatness by military conquest. And because from the time that Moses led the people to the Promised Land, they were at war and constantly. And then Solomon's father, David, was such a great military figure that he was able to subdue all their enemies and buy a time of peace. So Solomon is kind of the first great person in this history to establish his greatness not through any military activity at all, but through his wisdom and his kindness and his understanding. And as opposed to most of the history in the Hebrew Bible, where the Jewish people were a people set apart from the other nations and the other religions and all that, Solomon established relationships with Hiram of Tyre, and he married the Pharaoh's daughter, so he established a relationship with Egypt, and he created this world of commerce that was what today would be called globalism. It's the sense that everybody made out. He created the win-win. Before him, everything was a zero-sum game. You beat your enemies.
Right.
With him, there was this sense that everybody can win. We live at peace. Everybody makes money. He established trade routes. He brought amazing, products and things from foreign countries into his kingdom, and he sent many amazing things out. He gave gifts. He was there's a story in 1 Kings where the Queen of Sheba visits Solomon, and when she sees the grandeur of his kingdom, her breath is taken away to where she had no spirit left in her. And then she asked him a number of difficult questions and was so impressed with his answers, the wit of his answers. Unfortunately, we're not told in 1 Kings what those questions or answers were. But it was, he established the glory time in the history of the Jews, which was over immediately after he died.
Wow.
And the kingdom split. You know, there was no longer, in his day, the kingdom of Israel went from the banks of the Euphrates to the Egyptian border. It was gigantic. And Scripture, which may be exaggerating, said it was the greatest kingdom the world had ever known. Now, I have to add here that when you're talking about the historical Solomon, there is no such thing. There's no proof of his existence in archaeology or in... It's interesting, the historians of the day, the first historians that have survived, whose works have survived, were the Egyptian historians. And they make no mention of the Jewish people. There is no report in Egyptian history of a great slave revolt led by Moses. There's nothing. And we don't, the Jewish people do not really enter recorded history until the time of the Roman Empire. And that's when really their historical provable existence begins.
So even King David is not a real person necessarily?
Well, there's no proof of it. Now, in archaeologists, there's three schools of belief about Solomon. One is that it's all made up, that there never was a kingdom this great. The middle path is that he did exist, but it's exaggerated. In other words, Jerusalem's probably no more than a city-state. And then there's the school that believes it's all true. So I just want to add that you have to be careful about your source with Solomon. And I want to say that the history I'm giving is the history from 1 Kings, and the great Jewish historian Michael, remind me his name.
Josephus.
Thank you. I just somehow go dark on that guy's name. He wrote the history of the Jewish people in the 1st century. He was one of the people who was involved in the revolution that the Jews had in the 1st century against the Romans, which was a failure. And he was taken prisoner, and he was put into, I believe he was put into a Roman household as a servant or something like that, but he was allowed to be educated, and then he was finally allowed to compile the first history of the Jewish people. And it really goes parallel with what we have in the Hebrew Bible. He goes into greater detail. But he, and interestingly enough, he saw Jesus Christ as the Messiah, which most Jews did not. So he, but his book, The History of the Jewish People, is the beginning of any kind of understanding. And I believe I read that he was allowed to travel all over the known world to collect, the oral traditions and the stories and the like. He is the first person who mentions the Ring of Solomon, which is kind of the beginning of some of the real supernatural tales of Solomon. But we should, before we get into that, we should talk about the fall of Solomon.
Yes, he does seem like a tragic figure. He starts out so well, and he reigned for a long time, correct?
40 years.
40 years, which is 40 years, 40 days.
Yeah. Exactly.
That's a little suspect.
All these numbers are kind of convenient.
Yeah.
He had a harem of 1,000 women. 700 wives, 300 concubines. So all of these numbers are...
Well, I think there could be something to the numbers that people go on about if you go through the Bible, because, I mean, numerology has been around for a long time, and it is something I think people would sort of put into books either consciously or subconsciously.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, and so much of the Bible is coded.
Yeah.
It really is. And that's what gives rise to things like numerology. I mean, it's just there's a repetition. There's a formulaic repetition of things. And so the fall of Solomon the story goes in First Kings that he was seduced, in a sense, by one of his wives to construct a temple to a god from another religion, from, I believe it was, a Syrian religion, and burn sacrifices to that god. And in the eyes of the Hebrew Bible, that's the greatest sin you could commit. So the story is that after he had done that, God left him. God robbed him of wisdom, and he became greedy. He became a tyrant. He enslaved people. He imposed punishing taxes on the people to pay for the temple. And I don't want to leave out that he did build the great temple.
Right.
I've sort of left that out.
That's important.
And so we can get back to that
Right.
when we get into some of this other stuff. But he 7 years to build the temple. And it was through his relationships that he'd established with Hiram of Tyre and with the Pharaoh that he was able to get, the artisans and the materials to build the temple. And we get that in Masonic tradition. The story of Hiram Abiff, the widow's son of Naphtali, who came over and was the head architect. That's in First Kings. That's mentioned in First Kings. So yes, he built the temple, which was the glory, the crown glory of all the history of Judaism.
Before we get to the temple, I do want to talk about the concubine and wife situation we talked before the show, because you mentioned it is a formula in the Old Testament.
Right. So his fall was that he was seduced by a woman to build this temple to another god. And that was sort of the end of his glory. And I am suggesting that this might be BS. It's a suggestion. In the time of King Josiah, which was 500 years later, and this was the time of the prophet Jeremiah, just before the fall of Jerusalem, there was a king, Josiah, who introduced reforms, listening to the prophets, trying to change the ways, and the temple had by then gotten very corrupt. So there was a cleansing of the temple. And in cleansing the temple, they rediscovered the lost book of Deuteronomy, which had been neglected again, and they decided this is the reason why we're in trouble. We've lost the book of Deuteronomy. So they got out the book of Deuteronomy and said, we got to do everything according to the book of Deuteronomy. And biblical historians, starting with Gerhard von Rott at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, he came up with this formula of biblical criticism in which he detected 4 different styles, which he called the Elohist, the Jehovah style, and the wisdom literature, and the Deuteronomic historian. And the Deuteronomic historian, von Rod believed, went in and added things to Scripture to make the point that when you worship other gods, you're going to be in trouble. And if it is thought that by biblical scholars that this might have been an add-on, this story of the fall of Solomon, as a way of explaining what happened within weeks of Solomon's death, which was the split of the kingdom of Israel into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, which meant the end of the glory days, the end of the great empire. So the idea, the formula being, you worship other gods, you're going to lose it all. So you lose the favor of God, and it is by the favor of God that the Jews were able to accomplish anything that they accomplished. That's the point of the Deuteronomic historian. And if you look at the formula, the idea that Solomon was seduced into committing this great sin by a woman, this is a familiar formula in the Old Testament. You have Adam and Eve. Eve seduces Adam into eating of the apple. Samson gets his hair cut by a woman and loses his power. It's a repeating story, which makes it somewhat suspect. The guys are blaming the women. You know, it's just.
Don't some people think it was also an allusion to the takeover of the more, not matriarchal societies, but where women and goddesses were powerful? That there was this takeover of that culture. That this is the form of it. That they're saying we're gonna, you submit to us now.
Yes.
That you were formerly powerful, but now, which I've never understood this whole. No one's ever been able to explain exactly why that happened.
It's a repeating thing.
Yeah,
I mean, it happens again with Christianity and the Druids and all of that. It's a formula that is repeated. And you have the Mary Magdalene story. I know we had a whole show about Mary
That was
Magdalene,
the first show we did.
Was
yes.
it?
Yeah.
the where she was just sort of taken out of history and turned into a prostitute.
Right.
For which there is no backing. And
now there's the whole thing about her carrying Jesus' baby.
Right.
Which it's not that that's offensive, but it's I know we're getting a little off topic, but it's again sort of taking away from who she really was based on scripture.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And I don't know why we keep doing that particularly with the women in the Bible, it seems like.
Well, as I've said on this show before, dear Pope, let the women be priests. Why not? I just don't get why not. But it goes back to what you said, that what's the reason for this? There's no logical reason presented for it.
Right.
But I just wanted to read, there is, as we get into the magic a little bit, around the 2nd century, there appears this pseudepigraphal book. And you know what pseudepigraphal means? It means there's apocryphal books, which are books that did not make it into the Bible. And then there's pseudepigraphal books, which are books that are attributed to someone falsely.
Oh.
So this is the Testament of Solomon. And I'm not saying it wasn't written by Solomon, but I'm just saying that's the general opinion. But it's a first-person account to his son. He's trying to warn his son of the dangers. And in the book, Solomon has power over all angels and demons, and he summons the demons to appear before him one by one, and has them tell him their power, and then he seals them with his ring and puts them to work building the temple. So according to this book, it's the demons and the angels who were the demons
that did the
by
work.
Enforced slavery did the work to build
And he
the
names
temple.
the demons?
They have names already, and that's how the conversation always begins. Is they tell him their names and they tell him their power. Like this specific demon says, "Well, I make men lustful for women, or I make men greedy, or I trick men into betraying their friends," or each one has a different power. And so he ends the testament telling his son, and this is all written to his son. He says. He's talking about the woman who seduced him into doing this act of blasphemy. He says, crafty Eros brought and laid by her for me 5 grasshoppers, saying, take these grasshoppers and crush them together in the name of the god Moloch, and then I will sleep with you, the woman says. And this I finally did, and at once the Spirit of God departed from me, and I became weak as well as foolish in my words. I then, wretch that I am, followed her advice, and the glory of God quite departed from me, and my spirit was darkened, and I became the sport of idols and demons. Wherefore I wrote out this testament, that ye who get possession of it may pity and attend to the last things and not to the first, so that you may find grace forever and ever. Amen. So that's after telling all of the stories of his power and all of this over demons and everything, it ends like this.
So this is one way in which the magical occult world, or one text that they can draw from for their source?
Well, it's interesting. Again, I said that the Jewish historian in the 1st century first mentions the ring. The ring was a ring that would seal demons like into a bottle. In Solomon makes an appearance in 1001 Arabian Nights where he seals a genie into a bottle with his ring, a genie who has displeased him. So so the idea is in the 1st century. This thing, the Testament of Solomon, that's 2nd century. By the time of Islam, which is around the 6th century, the 600s, I think, when the Quran was written. Excuse me. We just get a little water.
Sure. And I think we have sort of a comment or question from one of our viewers about the last thing you were talking about, the pseudo, I can't pronounce it, pigraphic books were not approved for inclusion in sacred text, Bible, but Enoch was in all the Dead Sea Scroll caves, etc.
Now Enoch, I would not call a pseudepigraphal book. Enoch has a certain amount of respectability. It's a question of, in the 4th century, they had the Council of Nicaea, and they decided what would be in the Bible and what would not.
Right.
And there are certain books, a collection of books called the Apocrypha, which appear in the Greek Septuagint, which is a 1st century Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And those books, I don't think Enoch is one of them, but I don't know, and I'll put the question out. If anybody does know, say so. But those books were translated by Saint Jerome into Latin as part of the Latin Vulgate, which is the Catholic Bible. So the Catholics include those books in their Bible. The Protestants do not. But it's that does not in any way suggest that they are not authentic or that they are not ancient. The Gospel of Thomas, which I honor very highly, it wasn't even found until the 20th century, the Nag Hammadi findings. And historians, archaeologists believe this is real. This was probably really written by Thomas. But it's not in the Bible because it wasn't around for the 4th century and it didn't make the cut. It was also seen as a Gnostic gospel. And by then there was the battle between the Christians and the Gnostics, where any scripture that reeked of Gnosticism was rejected right away. Anyway, to get back to the magic stuff and the demons and all that, by the time of the Quran, Solomon is seen as someone who has power over all animals, all living forms, and demons and angels. And I just want to go back in 1 Kings, you don't have any mention of demons and angels because that stuff isn't in the Old Testament. I believe that all of the demon and angel stuff comes in to the later books of the Old Testament that were written after the fall of Jerusalem, when the Jews were living in captivity in other lands, Babylon and Persia and different other lands, and they were exposed to the religions of the Near East. And that the angels and the demons kind of show up as a result of that in Scripture, in the later books of the Old Testament. So the mixing of Solomon with angels and demons is sort of the mixing of different traditions a little bit.
Right.
So so in Arabia, before Islam, there was a religion that believed in jinn or jinni, which becomes the word genie. And these were spirits that would whisper in your ear and, in a sense, take over your soul, and basically just take over your whole body. You'd be gone. And Solomon was seen as having power over them, having power over the jinn, making them do his bidding. But it is believed they tell a different story of the fall of Solomon.
Oh.
Their story is that one of the jinn that he had imprisoned escaped, and entered into him and just took over his body. So for the last
that's more believable, actually. Well, it's interesting how the Western occult, I mean, I know Aleister Crowley helped to perpetuate the interest in the whole demon and conjuring the demons. Even though the angels are mentioned, you always hear with like some of the OTO people, they work with the demons. And what troubles me sometimes is there was one fellow that was working. He says, it's not a big deal. I don't know why everybody thinks it's such a big deal. And I'm like, it's a demon? I mean, that alone could be a demon talking, because it sounds like they're particularly powerful, and I'm not against necessarily invoking them, but it seems like you should know what you're doing. I mean, I wouldn't personally do it because I don't want to deal with demons, but I just feel like they could be a lot of trouble,
And why court trouble?
Well,
really,
I don't understand that myself. But then there's the argument that maybe it's about incorporating our shadow side, and I'm not sure about that either. But that's one argument, is that the angel demon is about if you invoke both, you're kind of trying to integrate your magical self on some level. But I don't understand the need to invoke demons personally. But, it's cool if you feel like you have a handle on it. But I think that one about Solomon being taken over, that makes more sense to me than anything else you've said so far about his downfall.
But it also shows how revered he was by the Muslims. I mean,
I didn't know that, actually.
Yeah, I mean, they saw him as being, of course, they have in Islam, there's a list of prophets. I forget how many there are, but certainly... Moses is in there, and the last prophet is Muhammad, and then they say there won't be any more prophets. Jesus was a prophet, but Solomon was a very important prophet to them. And I think some of that must have something to do with the fact, if he lived, if all of this is true in 1 Kings, that he opened up the world to commerce in a sense, and was a globalist, and did business with people in the Near East and all of this, so that in the 10th century, you have the Islamic world is the most civilized part of the world, and they come up with all of this stuff, Arabic numbers, ways of merchant practices, all of these things that are a part of our lives today, that they were, at that time, the greatest society on earth at a time when my ancestors were still eating with their hands. They were very sophisticated, very evolved. And so I think Solomon is revered by them because he's seen as being that way too. Mm-hmm. It's the win-win. It's the let's all get rich.
Right.
Let's break down the barricades, free trade, let's share what we have with each other.
We need Solomon back.
We do. No, it's like now globalist is a dirty word in politics. It's right. Like you want to say he's a globalist. It's like, so why is that so bad? We have a globe that we share.
Right.
And we have concerns about the future of it. And, that will affect everybody. So all of these borders and boundaries are artificial, man-made, temporal things. Mm-hmm. I want to add that Solomon is credited with the part of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, that is called the wisdom literature, and that includes the books of Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, and the Song of Solomon. And these books are just about worldly wisdom. The book of Ecclesiastes begins with vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And what that means, if you go back to the Hebrew, it sounds like it means that, loving yourself is all there is in life. It doesn't mean that. It means what is seen as vain or vanity is that which is fleeting. And what it means is all is fleeting. Life goes by fast. And when it's done, it's done. You're on, the world moves on to something else. And so that the definition of the present moment is a very difficult thing to establish, because once you've said it, it's past, and that's, it's, so the wisdom literature is like that. It's not particularly well ordered. it's just random thoughts, but they are full of things to explore. And if he did write those books, he was really something.
Yeah, I came across the notion that he was a prolific writer. And the other thing, I don't know if this is true or not, that he was also associated with exorcism, not just with demonic.
Yes, he is seen by, and that's, again, something that the Islamic world tags him with. That his great success as an exorcist. And that, again, that goes to his control over demons. He's able to order them around.
There seems to be a little bit of, even though you say that Jesus denounces him in the New Testament, you said earlier, but there seems to be some qualities of Solomon that sort of pre-shadow Jesus.
Well, I didn't mean that he denounces him.
Okay.
He's sort of, it's sort of a jab. You know, he's just saying that creation is better, more beautiful than Solomon's kingdom at its height. That's it. I mean, but that's his mention of Solomon. The Jesus is seen as someone, from the Christian point of view, Jesus is seen as somebody who kind of supplants Solomon. He's a descendant of Solomon, as a descendant of David. So he's kind of in the same family, but he did not have a harem of 1,000 women. He did not have great wealth. He did, there's so many things that represent Solomon, Jesus did not have.
Yeah, and I came up with my own theory about chastity in the church. They had to counter all those concubine and wives. Like there was just, they said, okay, now there's none allowed. We've had all 1,000 concubine and wives, and so the pendulum has to swing to the middle eventually, Well,
when you think about it, the main thing about Solomon, his charge from his father David and all of that is to walk in the ways of God and to respect and obey the law of Moses. The 10 Commandments definitely, calls out adultery. Now, how do you define adultery when you have 700 wives? And so if you covet your neighbor's wife, you just make her your wife because you're king.
Right.
And this is what David did with Bathsheba that made God very angry. And this is an interesting point about Solomon, because David was seen as a favorite of God, God's favorite in a sense, and the thing he did that offended God was he sent Uriah into battle where he would be killed so he could take Bathsheba, Uriah's wife, as his own. And God punished him he didn't remove his favor from David, but he punished him in the part of his life where David had sinned, his personal life. And one of David's sons tried to organize a revolution against him, and that hurt him deeply, and that's how he was punished. And also, David and Bathsheba had their first child, and the child died, and that was seen as part of their punishment. Then the second child was Solomon, and the name Solomon means peace. And he was God's peace offering to David as a way of saying, okay, we're even, And that, to me, is the most essential thing about Solomon as king, is that he reigned over peace. And there are not many Jewish kings that got to do that, because once Solomon died, and Jeroboam, what's his son's name? I always have to look up the name. Rehoboam. Rehoboam became king, and within weeks of Solomon's death, there was a great war within the empire, and the kingdom of Israel split in two: the northern kingdom, Israel, and the southern kingdom, Judah, which housed Jerusalem and the great temple. And that was the end of the glorious empire. It lasted, for 40 years under Solomon, basically, and that was the end. So there was the peacetime was over. But during Solomon's reign, it was a time of peace, and given all these 40 years of peace, they were able to accomplish things that just set the world on fire, according to 1 Kings.
Now, going back to the idea that what if this wasn't true at all, any of this, and it was a metaphor for something that has been taken on by, for instance, Freemasons, the idea of building the temple, which has also been taken on by the occult world as building the inner temple, and that Solomon is part of that ability to help you to build your inner temple.
And that's something that's really reflected in the wisdom literature. That even in the Masonic world, there's this almost worship of geometry, not for its mathematical qualities, but for its philosophical qualities. You know, what it means, how you can use geometry as symbolism to having a rich inner life. And that's the kind of thing that I would associate with Solomon the most.
And that's in the Bible. They do have very specific measurements of the temple building, right?
Good question. Not as specific as the great Jewish historian. He went into much more specifics than that. There's some, but it's not as much as back in the book of Exodus, when they talk about what God said they had to do as they carried the tabernacle and the great scroll and everything. That was just a ton of pages of measurements and all of this kind of stuff. It doesn't go into it that deeply with those kinds of specifics. That is more in Masonic tradition.
Oh, okay.
But the idea of using all that as a metaphor for enlightenment, for personal enlightenment, I would really say that's Solomonic or Solomon-esque or whatever kind of word we use. That's him in a nutshell. So if there were no Solomon, there was probably somebody that came up with these ideas, because they took root not just in Jewish culture, but all over the world.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if it's based on some other mythology too, just like, some of Jesus' story and the dying God, and, the resurrection comes from, there are other mythologies that have that, Osiris, and you wonder who is that. Solomon is not quite so obvious though, like who would he be connected to, like mythologically?
Well, when you look at the fact that he really opened up the civilized world to trading with each other and sharing things, you could see where other stuff could come in. The stuff from other cultures would be the opening point. Whereas before that, when they're just at war with everybody, there wouldn't be so much of that.
Well, the one that comes to mind would be Thoth, because he's associated with commerce. Mm-hmm. And also with writing and language. But it's just Solomon is interesting from that point of view too. It seems like, I don't know enough about all of the mythologies, mostly just the major ones that most anyone in the occult world knows about. But he sort of stands alone a little bit. And I almost wanted to go, I definitely feel more inspired to read, Ecclesiastes. And I know I've read some of that, and I do like some of the...
It's interesting. If you read it, read some commentary on it. Because if you read more than one commentary on the book of Ecclesiastes, you'll be exposed to 2 points of view. Because there's so many ways, there's so many roads in and out of those words, and Proverbs as well, but really Ecclesiastes is, I think, would be his most important work. And there's so many ways of, and I would really point toward Jewish writers. They know that stuff so well. I think, to me, Christian theologians are so busy trying to sell a specific point of view that they don't really explore this stuff as well as Jewish scholars. Jewish scholars, I was doing a a paper when I was at Claremont. I was doing a paper on the prophet Jeremiah, and I just called the Jewish Center in West Hollywood, and I got a rabbi on the phone, and I asked him a couple of questions. He just went on for days, man. Fascinating stuff that I had never read. I mean, I thought I'd read all this stuff, but Jewish scholars have this stuff down so well.
Huh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, kind of makes sense a little bit. Now, how do you feel about Solomon personally?
Well, that's a good question. I think that he, like I said before, I think he was a great globalist, and that the greatest things about him were his dedication to making the world better for his subjects. And you don't get that with every king. You know, there's so much in the history of English kings, and it's all the battles, all the wars, and all this stuff. It's about power and gaining more, or conquering other countries, or whatever. Solomon was not conquering countries. He was working with them. He was saying, let's all get rich. And that's a thing in the 20th century, when the now accursed globalism sort of started. There were problems with it. American workers suffered because you could get cheaper labor somewhere else or whatever. But one of the things about it, if you've got two countries that are making each other rich, they're not going to go to war with each other. There's this sense that, if we can find a way where everybody benefits, and that's the kind of thing Solomon did. That was his wisdom. That was what, and very significant, the fact that what he asked God for was an ability to be good at social justice. That's what he asked God for. Now, from today's point of view, is like, well, he's got, wives and concubines and all that, and that wouldn't be so cool
Me Too
today.
movement wouldn't like that.
They would not be cool
I don't blame
today.
them.
And you can't.
But that was cultural, though. I mean, wasn't it a time where that was normal? I'm not saying it's right,
that's such a good question. And we should do a whole show on that, because you have the 10 Commandments. You have the commandment against adultery. So does that mean, when does it become the thing where it's a man and a woman? And that's what, when does monogamy come in? And it's this monogamy, wait a minute. Yeah, monogamy. But it's the same thing as monotheism. When does one God come in? Because it's all this stuff about, they don't say there's only one God, so if you're worshiping other gods, it's a wank. It's not saying that. It's saying don't worship these other gods. They're there, and by offering sacrifices to them, you do get results, but you got to worship the God of Abraham, Moses, it morphs later into the idea of there is only one God, but I'm not sure when. And I would say the same thing about marriage. When does monogamy become the standard? It's a very good question. I don't know
that it would be quite so difficult to take if it was a two-way street. But it's not. It's men having all the wives. It's not women having all the husbands.
I wish I could quote specifics, but there are examples of women having more than one husband.
I personally feel like there'd be way too much drama. So.
Why would women want a bunch of husbands?
But no, it's the whole. I mean, it might be a good, interesting show about sexuality and religion and how it's evolved and power, and then and what is really healthy, I don't know. I don't think we do know. I mean, we're at least now in a culture where we're allowing, transgender people to be out more and sexuality be talked about in general. So in some ways, I think we're evolving as a species around sexuality.
There's a pretty good cultural war going on about that. I mean, I think we're in danger of maybe moving backward there. I think there's a grave danger of that, because people who, in a sense, are what you and I would call evolved. I don't have a negative issue with somebody else being gay. I'm cool with that. Somebody who wants to do a sex change thing, Well, okay, but I'm still a little creeped out by it because I'm of the old world that much. What I believe is happening is, and this gets back to Wesleyanism, in which I was raised, the teaching that we're going on to perfection, is that more and more we will come to realize that we are all one. And in that process, barricades will fall. Barricades that we think are God-made, such as barricades between nations, barricades between religions, barricades between men and women. That all of these barricades between races, all of these are temporal, and that we will evolve beyond them. So I believe that a lot of the tension going on in that area and the attention given to people who believe they were born into the wrong body or whatever is a part of that, is part of the growing pain.
Well, the thing, though, I wouldn't say it, transgender, I feel the same way about transgender as gay people. If it's really what they want to do and that's who they are, I think it's fine. Because,
well, exactly.
And it's, if you think about it, people spend more time and money on plastic surgery that can be quite dangerous, and we don't necessarily judge them negatively. We might think, wow, they're really spending a lot of money. So why is it any different? Well, it's because it's related to sexuality. Anything related to sexuality has a whole nother layer, which I think is maybe at some point we'll just see sexuality as natural. And my view is that someday we're not even going to have labels. It's whoever you are with, you're with. You're not going to be called gay or straight because it's an expression of human life, sexuality, and not even say love, because some people don't feel like they have to love and have sex, and that's fine with me. If that's who you are, great. So, I mean, at some point, maybe that's what's going to break down, is we're going to just see we're people, we're all different kinds of people, and difference is good according to nature, because that's how nature is. Nature is very different and diverse.
I would buy into all that completely, of what you just said. I completely agree. But I have personal reactions to things based on the way I was culturally raised. You know, it's like I was culturally raised to believe I am a man, you are a woman. These are things that I was culturally raised to believe. May not be true. It's culture. Culture changes. And it's not the same thing as believing that God created us to be this or that. You know, we don't know. We don't know. And so all of these things, we put labels on them in order to control the situation. And the control is bursting out at the seams right now. You know, the people are changes. The idea, you know, I get into these discussion groups in a scholarly world, academic world, or in my church, in the disciples world, where you go around the circle and everybody says what their pronouns are. These are my pronouns. That's how you start the meeting. I can't get with that. I can't get with
that's another
the idea that we would choose our pronouns.
Well, yeah,
I can't get with it.
I think that's a different topic to discuss, because it's so complicated, and it's really, I think that's going to pass.
I think yes,
I do
yes.
too. I mean, I don't think that's really necessary. It's making everything too much on the nose, for one thing. Like, I don't need to know everything about a person no matter what. I don't need to know your religion a lot of times, your sexuality, and especially if I'm working with you. And so I think that's going to go away. That's just kind of a strange phenomenon, because I mean, I know people that are, like someone like me, I don't put my pronouns out there. I mean, why should I? I don't put my religion out there personally. So it's like, I think if you want to do that, great. But if someone doesn't, great. It's just complicating things, though, because I can't even remember people's names, let alone their pronouns, and if they're Mr. or Miss or a Ms. And it's just hard on everyone to make things so, you know, that's not the battle we should be fighting.
But also the idea that I would decide what pronouns you use to describe me.
Yeah.
You know, it's that is something that I think is a problematic issue for some people. Yeah. But it's the growing pains of all this, of what we're becoming. And what we're becoming is good. And there's no going back. There's no going back to that world where there was none of that. You know, and that's what Solomon means when he says all is vanity. You know, all is passing. We're moving on to something, and we can't go back.
And then also coming back to Solomon, the idea that wisdom comes from the heart. That idea.
That's my favorite thing about him.
Yeah, and that is my favorite thing. And in Buddhism, when they do sort of body, speech, and mind, they point to the heart. The mind is the heart. Mm-hmm. And I've had this debate with a friend of mine about, she's always like kind of upset at her mind. And I said, well, that's not what mind is. You're talking about, of course, maybe the neurotic thoughts that we all have, the monkey mind. But the mind is something you do want to develop. The Buddhists do not say there's no mind. They want you to see what, the real mind is. What is it, not what we think it is. And so that's what struck me about Solomon when you said that, the heart. And so when you have friends that are going through whatever it is with some of this transgender, or they want to be called she now or he now, I think is sort of always looking at the intention from the heart. And I think that's how you can sometimes tell someone means well, and some people are really just, I don't know, they're just attention seekers in general in life. There's plenty of that in all areas.
Yeah, but whatever their reason, it should all be allowed.
Yes,
it should all be allowed.
Of course.
It's not the kind of thing that governments are here to say anything about.
The government had nothing to say about it.
No. And it should be allowed, and someone who wants to go a certain direction, if they're of a certain age. Now, somebody making a decision like that in the 4th grade, I don't know. But if they're of a certain age, absolutely, they should be allowed. And we have in our culture something very different from just about any other culture I know of, and that's this separation of church and state. This was unimagined in the Old Testament or in the New Testament. And even Britain, where they have freedom of religion, but they don't have separation of church and state.
I think Charles wants that, though.
Yes, I think so. And I think it's the way to go. It's
right.
a wonderful way to be, because people should not be governed in that sense. But having that in our culture for 200, however many years, I think has led us to come up with some pretty amazing concepts about how to live. Some of them are objectionable to some people, but, hey, yeah. I think that the idea everything should be judged by social justice. And Solomon, even though he did have all those wives and concubines, and we have to sort of scratch our heads about that,
right.
His basic principle in what he asked God for in his one wish, a heart that hears. He wanted to be a king under whom there was social justice. And that's, for his day and age, unique.
Yeah, I think he's a modern king. The more we've talked about him, we could use him today.
Yes, we could.
Even without the concubines and wives, unless that's what they want. I mean, I don't know. Maybe some people want to have that drama.
Well, we got to do a show on this.
The Real Housewives of King, the real concubines of King Solomon.
The real concubines of King Solomon.
That would be so funny.
Idea.
I think it'd be
a great show.
I could just see the drama, though. Oh, my God. Yeah, it could be a good show.
Well, we have reason to believe that they lived well, but we don't have reason to believe that they had any kind of personal freedom. And that's the dark side.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I said, it would be a good show to look at this sort of sequence of all that with women as, it makes them look like cattle, of course, just owning more women and makes you powerful.
Also, just putting yourself in Solomon's place, all the things he did, the building of the temple, the opening up of trade routes, all of this stuff, where did he find the time to propose to 700 women? It's just, wow. I mean,
maybe he never slept.
I
think we're running out of time, though. So anyway, thank you so much for coming back.
Well, this has been a great experience with King Solomon, and I really enjoyed it.
Definitely went down some corners I wasn't expecting, as always.
As we are wont to do.
Yeah. And thank you all for listening in.
I want to apologize to any transsexual. I didn't mean any offense at all.
Anyway, join us next time as we continue to explore the esoteric and the obscure together, and have a great week.